My name is Margaret Sullivan, I'm 52 years old, and I'm standing behind these cemetery oak trees watching my own funeral. The shock hits me like ice water as I hear my son Derek's voice trembling with fake emotion, reading a eulogy about my tragic car accident death that never happened. 300 people fill the chairs, dabbing their eyes while my daughter-in-law Brittany sobs theatrically into a tissue. I watch in disbelief as family members I trusted nod sympathetically, completely fooled by this elaborate deception designed to steal my $3 million inheritance. Before we dive into this unbelievable story of betrayal and revenge, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you're as shocked as I was discovering this conspiracy, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories. You won't believe what happens when the supposedly dead woman crashes her own funeral. 6 months ago, my world shattered when my beloved husband Robert passed away from a sudden heart attack. We'd been married for 15 wonderful years, and his death left me not only heartbroken but also inheriting his substantial estate worth over $3 million. The inheritance included our family home, multiple investment properties, and Robert's successful construction business that I'd helped him build from the ground up. My relationship with my son Derek had always been complicated. At 28 years old, he struggled to find his place in life, jumping from job to job and never quite settling down. When he married Brittany 2 years ago, I hoped she'd be a stabilizing influence. Instead, she seemed to encourage his worst impulses, constantly pushing him to ask for money and questioning why he wasn't getting a larger share of family assets. My stepdaughter Cassandra from Robert's first marriage had always been more responsible, working as a nurse and maintaining a respectful distance from family financial matters. After Robert's funeral, the tension in our family became unbearable. Derek and Brittany would visit constantly, not to comfort me in my grief, but to hint about their financial struggles and suggest I should consider updating my will. They complained about their mortgage payments, Brittany's student loans, and Derek's mounting credit card debt. Every conversation felt like a subtle negotiation about my future inheritance decisions. 2 weeks ago, I decided I needed space to process my grief and make important decisions about the estate. My sister Linda lived in rural Montana, and she'd been begging me to visit her ranch for years. The remote location seemed perfect for clearing my head and deciding how to structure my will fairly between Derek and Cassandra. I told Derek I'd be gone for a few weeks, that the area had no cell phone service, and that I needed this time alone to heal. What I didn't know was that Derek had been planning something sinister for months. Unbeknownst to me, he'd been meeting with a corrupt lawyer named Preston Willis, who specialized in helping desperate heirs accelerate their inheritances through questionable legal means. Derek had also been working with a dishonest hospital administrator who could forge death certificates for the right price. The plan they hatched was as elaborate as it was evil. While I was peacefully staying at Linda's ranch, completely disconnected from the outside world, Derek put his plan into motion. He paid off a homeless shelter worker to provide him with the body of a woman who died from an overdose, someone whose death wouldn't be investigated too closely. He arranged for this poor woman's body to be burned beyond recognition in a staged car accident, using my car that he'd stolen from my garage. The corrupted hospital worker issued a death certificate with my name, and Derek began spreading the news of my tragic demise. I returned from Montana 3 days early, feeling refreshed and ready to have honest conversations with my family about the future. But when I pulled into my driveway, I found the locks had been changed. Confused, I knocked on my neighbor Mrs. Patterson's door, only to have her burst into tears and pull me into a suffocating hug. "Margaret," she sobbed, "but you're supposed to be dead." Derek told us about the terrible accident. The pieces began falling together with horrifying clarity. Mrs. Patterson explained that Derek had been showing neighbors the fake death certificate, that funeral arrangements were already underway, and that the service was scheduled for this very afternoon. My own son had declared me dead and was preparing to bury an unknown woman in my place while stealing everything I owned. Standing in Mrs. Patterson's living room, I felt the same devastating loss I'd experienced when Robert died, but this betrayal cut even deeper. This wasn't death taking away someone I loved, this was someone I loved trying to erase me from existence for money. I realized I had only hours before Derek's deception became legally irreversible, and I knew exactly what I had to do. My hands shook as I sat in my car outside Patterson Funeral Home, watching the steady stream of mourners arriving for my own memorial service. The sight was surreal and heartbreaking. These were people who genuinely cared about me, colleagues from my consulting business, neighbors I'd known for years, friends from my book club. They were all here to honor a life that hadn't ended, manipulated into grief by my son's monstrous lie. I knew I couldn't just storm in and announce myself. Derek would have prepared for that possibility, and I needed to understand the full scope of his deception before making my move. Instead, I disguised myself with a black hat, oversized sunglasses, and a dark coat I'd purchased from a thrift store. Looking nothing like the Margaret Sullivan these people knew, I slipped inside among the other mourners. The funeral home's main chapel was packed beyond capacity. Derek had spared no expense in creating an elaborate memorial service, complete with professional floral arrangements, a beautiful mahogany casket, and enlarged photographs of me displayed on easels. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was spending my money to stage my fake death so he could steal more of my money. I positioned myself in a back corner where I could observe everything while remaining inconspicuous. Derek stood near the casket receiving condolences, playing the role of grieving son with Oscar-worthy performance. He wore Robert's favorite black suit, which made my blood boil with rage. Brittany clung to his arm, dabbing her eyes with tissues and accepting sympathy from guests with practiced grace. What struck me most was how many people had come to pay their respects. My business partner James Morrison sat in the front row looking genuinely devastated. My accountant Leonard Wright appeared uncomfortable, occasionally glancing nervously toward Derek. Dr. Williams, my family physician, sat with his wife near the middle of the chapel. Even my hairdresser Sophie had closed her salon early to attend. As I listened to conversations around me, I began to understand how Derek had managed to fool so many people so quickly. He'd told everyone that I'd been driving back from Montana when my car skidded off a mountain road and caught fire. He claimed the accident was so severe that my body was burned beyond recognition, which explained why the casket remained closed. He'd even produced what appeared to be official police reports and coroner's statements to support his story. The guest book by the entrance contained hundreds of signatures from people I'd never expected to see. Former clients from my consulting firm had driven hours to attend. Members of the charity board I'd served on for years filled an entire row. These genuine displays of affection made Derek's betrayal even more painful to witness. But not everyone seemed completely convinced by Derek's performance. My best friend Helen Mackenzie sat in the third row, her face red and swollen from crying, but something in her expression suggested suspicion rather than just grief. She kept staring at Derek with a look I'd seen before when she sensed someone wasn't being truthful. Even more interesting was Cassandra's behavior. My stepdaughter sat apart from Derek and Brittany, wearing a simple black dress and avoiding eye contact with anyone. Every few minutes she'd check her phone nervously, as if she was waiting for important news. When Derek tried to include her in conversations with mourners, she gave short, uncomfortable responses and quickly excused herself. The most disturbing element was watching Preston Willis work the room like a political candidate. The corrupt lawyer moved smoothly between groups of mourners, subtly gathering information about my business relationships and financial connections. I realized he wasn't just here to pay respects, he was conducting intelligence gathering to ensure their scheme wouldn't face legal challenges. As the service began, I noticed several people I didn't recognize sitting together near the side exit. They wore expensive suits but carried themselves like men accustomed to violence. One of them kept checking his watch impatiently while scanning the crowd with cold, calculating eyes. Something about their presence made me deeply uncomfortable, though I couldn't yet understand their connection to Derek's plan. The formal ceremony began with Derek stepping up to the podium to deliver what should have been a son's loving eulogy. Instead, I listened in horror as he recounted a completely fabricated version of our relationship. He spoke about cherished mother-son memories that had never happened, described family traditions we'd never shared, and painted himself as a devoted child who'd always been close to his loving mother. My mom was my best friend, Derek lied smoothly into the microphone. She always supported my dreams and believed in me even when I doubted myself. We talked every day, and she was so excited about becoming a grandmother soon. This last statement was news to me, and I noticed Brittany's sharp intake of breath, suggesting it was news to her too. But it was what happened during a brief recess that truly revealed the depth of Derek's betrayal. I followed him and Brittany to a small consultation room where they thought they could speak privately. Hidden behind a partially open door, I heard their real conversation for the first time. "The lawyer says all the transfers should be complete by tomorrow morning," Derek whispered urgently to his wife. "We'll have full access to her accounts, and we can start liquidating everything immediately." Brittany's voice was cold and calculating, completely different from the grief-stricken widow act she'd been performing. "Good. I already contacted the real estate agent about listing the house. And that ridiculous consulting business of hers can be sold to Brennan Industries. They've been trying to acquire it for years." "What about all her personal stuff?" Derek asked. "The jewelry, the artwork, all those books she collected?" "Estate sale this weekend," Brittany replied dismissively. "I'm not keeping any of her sentimental garbage. We need cash, not memories. Your gambling debts to Romano aren't going to pay themselves." My heart stopped at the mention of Romano. Vincent Romano was known throughout the city as a dangerous loan shark who operated several illegal gambling operations. If Derek owed money to Romano, it explained the desperate timeline of his scheme and the presence of those threatening men I'd noticed earlier. "How much do you still owe him?" Brittany continued. $200,000, Derek admitted. "Plus interest that keeps growing every day. He gave me until midnight tonight to produce the money, or..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. "Well, after tomorrow, that'll be pocket change for us," Brittany said with satisfaction. $3 million will solve all our problems and give us the lifestyle we deserve. Your mother was too selfish keeping all that money to herself anyway." I had to grip the doorframe to keep from collapsing. Not only had my son staged my death to steal my inheritance, but he'd done it to pay off gambling debts to a violent criminal. The money Robert and I had worked our entire lives to accumulate was going to fund Derek's reckless lifestyle and satisfy a loan shark's demands. But the revelations weren't over. As they prepared to return to the service, Derek's phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and went pale. "It's Cousin Martha," he told Brittany. "She wants her cut for helping set up the alibi." I listened in shock as Derek answered the call on speaker. My own cousin Martha, who'd been like a sister to me growing up, had been part of the conspiracy. She'd helped Derek establish the story about my extended trip to Montana, provided corroborating details to anyone who asked, and even sent sympathy cards to neighbors to support the fiction of my death. "Derek, honey," Martha's voice came through the phone sickeningly sweet. "The service looks beautiful on the live stream. You did such a nice job honoring Margaret's memory. Now, about our agreement." $25,000, just like we discussed, Derek confirmed. "You'll have it transferred tomorrow. And my Harold helped with those insurance forms, don't forget. He wants his $10,000 too." Uncle Harold, another family member I'd trusted, had sold me out for money. The conspiracy wasn't just Derek and Brittany. It involved multiple family members who'd helped orchestrate my fake death for their own financial gain. As they ended the call and returned to the memorial service, I remained hidden in the consultation room, trying to process the magnitude of betrayal. My son hadn't just stolen my money, he'd recruited my own family members to help him erase me from existence. People I'd loved and supported for years had eagerly participated in my destruction for relatively small payoffs. The worst part was realizing how long this had been planned. Derek mentioned insurance forms that Harold had helped with, suggesting they'd been working on this scheme for months, possibly since Robert's funeral. While I'd been grieving my husband and trying to be a supportive mother, my own child had been plotting to murder me legally and financially. I returned to my seat in the back of the chapel just as the formal ceremony resumed, but now every word felt like another knife in my heart. Derek introduced a series of speakers who would share memories of my life, and I watched in amazement as person after person took the podium to honor someone they believed was dead. Helen was the first to speak, and her genuine grief was almost unbearable to witness. My best friend of 20 years struggled through her prepared remarks, choking back tears as she described our friendship. "Margaret was the most generous person I knew," she said, her voice breaking. "When my husband left me last year, she was the one who helped me get back on my feet. She gave me the down payment for my apartment and never asked for anything in return except friendship. I watched Helen's honest emotion and felt guilty for the pain my fake death was causing her. She was suffering real grief over a fabricated tragedy, manipulated into mourning by Derek's cruel deception. When she mentioned how she'd called my phone dozens of times after hearing about the accident, desperate to somehow reach me one last time, I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out. Next came my business partner James Morrison, who spoke about our professional relationship with obvious admiration. Margaret built her consulting firm from nothing, he said proudly. When we started working together 5 years ago, she had 3 clients and operated out of her kitchen. Through her dedication and brilliance, she grew it into one of the most respected firms in the state. She was supposed to be my business partner for the next 20 years. James's speech revealed another layer of Derek's betrayal. My consulting firm was worth at least $800,000, built through years of hard work and client relationships. Derek and Brittany planned to sell it immediately to competitors who would probably destroy what I'd spent my career creating. They had no appreciation for the legacy I'd built or the clients who depended on our services. The speeches continued with colleague after colleague, friend after friend, sharing genuine memories of our relationships. My accountant Leonard looked increasingly uncomfortable as speaker after speaker mentioned my business acumen and careful financial planning. He kept glancing toward Derek with an expression that suggested guilt, making me wonder about his role in the conspiracy. But it was Cassandra who provided the most surprising moment of the ceremony. My stepdaughter approached the podium reluctantly, clutching a small piece of paper with what appeared to be hastily written notes. Instead of delivering a prepared eulogy, she spoke from the heart in a way that made me suspect she knew more than she was letting on. Margaret was always honest with me, Cassandra said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Even when the truth was difficult, she never lied to protect my feelings or manipulate me for her own benefit. She taught me that real love means telling the truth, even when it's hard to hear. I think Margaret would want all of us to remember the importance of honesty, especially during difficult times like these. Her emphasis on honesty and truth felt deliberately pointed, and she kept looking toward the back of the chapel where I was sitting. When our eyes met briefly, I saw something in her expression that made my heart race. Did Cassandra somehow know I was alive? Was she trying to communicate with me through her speech? The ceremony's most disturbing moment came when Preston Willis took the podium to explain the legal aspects of my estate. Under the guise of providing comfort to mourners about how my affairs would be handled, he was actually preparing them for the rapid asset transfers he'd illegally arranged. Margaret was a careful planner who made sure all her legal documents were properly prepared, Preston announced smoothly. Her will is clear and comprehensive, with specific instructions for asset distribution that will be implemented immediately. The family won't have to endure a lengthy probate process during this difficult time. I knew this was complete fiction. My actual will was locked in my safe deposit box at First National Bank, and it definitely didn't leave everything to Derek. But Preston was using the funeral as an opportunity to establish the legitimacy of forged documents that would transfer my assets within hours of the ceremony's conclusion. As the formal speeches ended and the ceremony moved toward its conclusion, those intimidating men I'd noticed earlier began moving closer to Derek. Their presence cast a shadow over the entire gathering, and I realized Romano's enforcers were here to ensure Derek followed through on his promises. If Derek couldn't provide the $200,000 by midnight, the consequences would be severe. The final element that made my heart ache was watching the genuine mourners who'd come to honor my memory. My hairstylist Sophie had brought flowers from her own garden. The woman who cleaned my house, Maria, sat quietly in tears, probably worrying about losing her job. Elderly Mrs. Chen from the neighborhood had walked 6 blocks to attend, carrying a casserole she'd prepared for Derek's family. These were real people experiencing real grief over my supposed death, manipulated into mourning by Derek's elaborate lie. Their genuine love and respect for me made his betrayal even more heinous, because he wasn't just stealing money, he was weaponizing the affection of innocent people to accomplish his criminal goals. As the formal ceremony concluded and moved into a reception period, I overheard conversations that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy against me. This wasn't just Derek and Brittany's scheme. It involved a network of family members, professionals, and acquaintances who'd all been recruited to participate in my destruction. I followed Cousin Martha to a quiet corner where she was whispering urgently with Uncle Harold. Staying hidden behind a large floral arrangement, I listened as they discussed their roles in the conspiracy with casual indifference to the lives they were destroying. The travel story worked perfectly, Martha said with satisfaction. When people asked where Margaret was, I told them she'd gone to Linda's ranch to grieve privately. Nobody questioned it because it sounded exactly like something she'd do. Harold nodded approvingly. And those insurance forms were a stroke of genius. Derek took out that additional life insurance policy 6 months ago, right after Robert's funeral. $200,000 with him as the sole beneficiary. The insurance company won't even investigate because we have death certificates and police reports. I felt sick realizing Derek had been planning my fake death since his stepfather's funeral. While I'd been mourning Robert and trying to support Derek through his grief, he'd been calculating how to murder me legally and financially. The additional insurance policy meant he'd been actively preparing for this moment for months. What about the neighbors? Martha asked. Are they buying the story? Completely, Harold replied. Mrs. Patterson feels so sorry for Derek. She's been bringing him casseroles all week and helping him cope with the tragedy. That old fool has no idea she's feeding the man who orchestrated his mother's fake death. Their casual cruelty toward Mrs. Patterson, who'd been nothing but kind to Derek his entire life, showed how little they cared about the innocent people they were deceiving. Mrs. Patterson was genuinely heartbroken over my supposed death, probably blaming herself for not somehow preventing the fictional accident. But the revelations continued as other family members joined the conversation. My childhood friend Joyce Williams approached with information about additional aspects of the conspiracy I hadn't yet discovered. The bank manager confirmed Derek has power of attorney papers that give him access to all of Margaret's accounts, Joyce reported. I told him Margaret had mentioned wanting to update her financial arrangements before the trip to Montana. He didn't question anything. Joyce had been my friend since elementary school. We'd been bridesmaids in each other's weddings, supported each other through divorces and family crises, and maintained our friendship for over 40 years. Now she was casually discussing how she'd helped Derek gain illegal access to my life savings. And the business accounts? Harold asked. Leonard the accountant provided all the financial records Derek needed, Joyce confirmed. For $5,000, he handed over everything, including client lists and contract details. Derek can sell the consulting firm immediately without any legal complications. My accountant Leonard, who'd prepared my taxes for 15 years and knew every detail of my financial life, had sold me out for a relatively small bribe. He'd provided Derek with confidential information that would allow them to dismantle my business quickly and profitably. The most shocking revelation came when Brittany's brother Tyler joined the group. I'd met Tyler only a few times at family gatherings, but apparently he'd played a crucial role in the conspiracy's most dangerous aspect. The accident scene was perfect, Tyler reported with disturbing pride. We used that homeless woman's body from the shelter, burned it beyond recognition in Margaret's car, and staged everything to look like she lost control on a mountain curve. The police won't investigate because they have no reason to doubt the evidence. I nearly gasped aloud realizing an innocent woman had died to provide the body for my fake accident. Derek's scheme hadn't just involved forged documents and financial fraud, it had required desecrating someone's remains and denying them proper burial. The moral depravity of using a homeless woman's body to stage my death showed how far Derek had fallen into criminal behavior. What about Dr. Williams? Martha asked. Can we trust him to keep quiet about the medical aspects? Tyler nodded confidently. He signed off on the death certificate without asking questions, and he's been telling patients that Margaret died in a tragic accident. For $10,000, he's maintaining complete professional silence about any inconsistencies. Dr. Williams had been my family physician for 8 years. He'd treated Robert during his final illness, helped me through my grief, and knew my medical history better than anyone. Yet he'd been willing to falsify my death certificate and participate in insurance fraud for a relatively modest payoff. As I listened to these family members and trusted professionals discuss their roles in destroying my life, I realized Derek hadn't just betrayed me, He'd corrupted an entire network of people I'd counted as friends and allies. The conspiracy involved at least 8 people who'd all been willing to participate in my legal murder for money. The most heartbreaking aspect was discovering how Derek had manipulated people's genuine concern for me into tools for his scheme. Mrs. Patterson's kindness had been weaponized to provide neighborhood credibility. Dr. Williams's medical authority had been purchased to legitimize forged documents. Leonard's professional access had been exploited to steal my business assets. But as devastating as these revelations were, I also noticed something else. Cassandra was not part of these conversations. My stepdaughter remained separate from Derek's conspirators, and every time someone approached her about the inheritance distribution, she gave evasive answers and quickly changed the subject. Her behavior suggested she either hadn't been included in the conspiracy or had chosen not to participate despite knowing about it. The reception concluded with an announcement that Preston Willis would read my will in the funeral home's private conference room. This was obviously not standard procedure, but Derek was using the occasion to establish the legitimacy of his forged documents in front of witnesses who could later testify to the will reading's authenticity. I managed to slip into the conference room behind a group of family members, positioning myself in the back where I could observe without being noticed. Preston had arranged the room like a legitimate legal proceeding, with my supposed will displayed prominently on the conference table alongside supporting documents that appeared professionally prepared. Ladies and gentlemen, Preston began with false solemnity. Margaret Sullivan was a remarkable woman who took great care in preparing for her family's future. Her will, updated just 3 months ago, provides clear instructions for distributing her assets in a way that reflects her love and priorities. 3 months ago I'd been in Florida visiting Robert's sister, and I definitely hadn't updated any legal documents. But Preston's forged will was convincing enough to fool anyone who didn't know the truth. The document bore what appeared to be my signature, was notarized with official stamps, and included specific details about my assets that only someone with inside knowledge could have known. The primary bequest, Preston continued, leaves the family residence at 12 Oak Street, along with all investment properties and business assets, to her beloved son Derek Sullivan and his wife Brittany. This reflects Margaret's confidence in their ability to manage the estate responsibly and honor her memory. I watched Derek's performance as the grieving son reluctantly accepting his inheritance. He dabbed his eyes with a tissue and spoke about feeling overwhelmed by my supposed trust in him. I just want to honor my mother's wishes and use this inheritance to build the kind of life she would have been proud of, he said with practiced emotion. Brittany played her role equally well, appearing humbled by my supposed generosity while secretly calculating how quickly they could liquidate everything. Margaret was like a second mother to me, she lied smoothly. We'll treasure her memory while using her gift to build a better future for our family. The will reading continued with smaller bequests that Derek had included to make the document appear more authentic. Helen was supposed to receive my jewelry collection, which she'd always admired. Several charities were listed as beneficiaries of specific donations that reflected my known philanthropic interests. Even Mrs. Patterson was mentioned as receiving a small bequest for her years of friendship and neighborhood watch participation. These details made the forged will particularly convincing because they reflected genuine aspects of my personality and relationships. Derek had clearly spent considerable time studying my preferences and connections to create a document that would seem believable to anyone familiar with my life. But the most disturbing aspect was watching the speed of the legal process Preston had arranged. Instead of the months-long probate process that normally followed someone's death, Preston announced that all asset transfers would be completed within 24 hours. Margaret specifically requested expedited distribution to avoid burdening her family with lengthy legal procedures during their grief, Preston explained. All necessary documentation has been prepared, and the transfers will be executed tomorrow morning. I knew this was completely fabricated. No legitimate probate court would approve such rapid asset transfers, especially involving millions of dollars. Preston was using fake court orders and forged judicial approvals to create the appearance of legal authority while actually conducting massive fraud. The timeline pressure was clearly driven by Derek's debt to Romano. The loan shark's midnight deadline meant Derek needed access to my money immediately, not after months of legitimate legal proceedings. Preston had structured the entire fraud around satisfying Romano's demands within hours of the funeral's conclusion. As the will reading concluded, I noticed those intimidating men from Romano's organization positioning themselves near the conference room exits. They weren't hiding their presence anymore. They wanted Derek to understand that his debt would be collected one way or another. If the inheritance scheme failed to provide the money by midnight, Derek would face consequences that extended far beyond financial embarrassment. The most heartbreaking moment came when Helen approached Preston about the jewelry bequest. My best friend was genuinely touched that I'd supposedly remembered her admiration for my collection, especially my grandmother's antique necklace that she'd complimented many times over the years. Margaret always said jewelry should be worn, not stored in boxes, Helen said through her tears. I'll treasure these pieces and think of her every time I wear them. Watching Helen's genuine gratitude for a bequest that had been fabricated to deceive her made me realize the psychological cruelty of Derek's scheme. He wasn't just stealing money, he was manipulating people's emotions and memories to accomplish his goals. Helen would spend the rest of her life treasuring jewelry she believed represented my final gift to her, never knowing it was actually evidence of her best friend's fake death. As the conference room emptied, I overheard Preston giving Derek final instructions about the money transfers. Romano's people will meet you at the bank tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp, he whispered urgently. The $200,000 will be transferred directly from your inheritance account to satisfy the debt. After that, you and Brittany will have full access to the remaining assets. I realized I was running out of time to stop this conspiracy. Within hours, Derek would have legal access to my money, Romano would be paid, and reversing the fraud would become nearly impossible. The forged documents were convincing enough to withstand casual scrutiny, and Derek had corrupted enough professionals to support his story if anyone raised questions. But as I prepared to leave the funeral home and plan my next move, I noticed Cassandra approaching me with deliberate intention. My stepdaughter had been watching me throughout the reception, and her expression suggested she'd figured out something the other mourners had missed. As the other mourners began filing out of the funeral home, Cassandra maneuvered herself next to me near the guest book table. Speaking in a voice barely above a whisper, she confirmed my growing suspicion that she knew more than she'd been letting on. I know who you are, she said quietly, pretending to sign the guest book while keeping her head down. Derek showed me a photo of the woman who supposedly died in the car accident, but her dental records don't match yours. I've been a nurse for 6 years, and I know how to verify medical identities. My heart raced as I realized Cassandra had been conducting her own investigation into Derek's claims. As a medical professional, she had access to resources and knowledge that allowed her to spot inconsistencies other people would miss. He tried to include me in his planning 3 months ago, she continued. He said you were getting old and might do something foolish with the inheritance if you weren't guided properly. When I refused to participate, he threatened to contest my father's will and have me cut out completely. I felt a surge of pride in Cassandra's integrity, followed immediately by anger that Derek had tried to manipulate her into joining his conspiracy. Robert had specifically included provisions in his will to protect Cassandra's inheritance from exactly this kind of family pressure. I've been documenting everything since then, Cassandra whispered, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. I have recordings of Derek discussing the plan, photographs of forged documents, and evidence of his gambling debts to Romano. I was hoping you'd somehow figure out what was happening and come back to stop him. The relief of finding an ally was overwhelming, but I also realized the danger Cassandra had placed herself in by gathering evidence against Derek. If he discovered her investigation, she could become a target for Romano's organization or be accused of participating in the conspiracy herself. We need to get Helen involved, Cassandra suggested. She's been questioning Derek's story from the beginning. She knows you better than anyone, and she's been asking uncomfortable questions about the accident details. I nodded, realizing Helen's suspicions could be the key to exposing Derek's deception. My best friend had always been incredibly perceptive about people's motives, and her genuine grief had probably been mixed with growing doubts about Derek's version of events. Cassandra guided me to a small alcove where Helen was sitting alone, staring at a photograph of Robert and me from our wedding anniversary last year. When I removed my sunglasses and hat, Helen's reaction confirmed that her suspicions had been building throughout the day. "I knew it," she whispered fiercely, grabbing my hands with trembling fingers. "I knew Derek was lying about something." The accident story never made sense, and he was too eager to provide details instead of being devastated about losing his mother. Helen's embrace was fierce and emotional, but also filled with rage about Derek's deception. "That monster made me plan your memorial service," she said angrily. "He had me call all your friends to tell them you were dead. I've been in agony for 3 days thinking I'd lost my best friend forever." As we hugged, Cassandra quickly explained the evidence she'd gathered and the timeline we were facing. Derek's debt to Romano had to be paid by midnight, which meant we had less than 6 hours to stop the asset transfers and expose the conspiracy. "I know Detective Samuel Wright from the domestic violence cases at the hospital," Cassandra offered. "He's honest and thorough, and he'll investigate if we can provide enough evidence to justify opening a fraud case." Helen immediately pulled out her phone. "I'm calling him now. Sam and I went to high school together, and he'll listen to what we have to say." While Helen contacted Detective Wright, Cassandra showed me the evidence she'd been collecting. Her phone contained recordings of Derek discussing the insurance fraud, photographs of Preston's office with forged documents visible, and detailed notes about the timeline of Derek's gambling problems and his meetings with Romano's representatives. "The most damaging evidence is Derek's own confession," Cassandra explained, playing a recording she'd made 3 weeks ago. Derek's voice was clearly audible discussing the homeless woman's body, the staged car accident, and his confidence that the fraud would be undetectable. "Preston says the bank transfers are completely legal once we have the death certificate and probate approval," Derek's voice said on the recording. "By tomorrow afternoon, we'll have access to everything, and Romano will be off our backs permanently." The recording continued with Derek describing how he'd recruited family members and professionals to support his story. He laughed about Mrs. Patterson's sympathy casseroles and joked about how easy it had been to convince Dr. Williams to falsify medical documents. But the most chilling part was Derek's complete lack of remorse about the psychological damage he was inflicting on innocent people. "Helen's been crying for 3 days straight," he said with amusement. "She actually thinks she lost her best friend. It's pathetic how easy it is to manipulate people's emotions." Detective Wright arrived within 20 minutes, accompanied by his partner Detective Maria Rodriguez. Both officers listened carefully as we presented the evidence, and their expressions grew increasingly serious as they understood the scope of Derek's conspiracy. "This is one of the most elaborate inheritance frauds I've ever seen," Detective Wright admitted. "The forged documents, the staged accident, the corrupted professionals, it's like something from a crime novel. But the evidence you've provided gives us more than enough grounds for immediate arrests." Detective Rodriguez was already on her radio coordinating with other units. "We need to freeze all financial accounts associated with the estate and obtain warrants for Derek Sullivan, Brittany Sullivan, and Preston Willis. We also need to contact Romano's organization to prevent any violent retaliation when Derek can't pay his debt." As the detectives prepared their operation, I realized we faced one more crucial challenge: exposing Derek's deception in a way that would undo the psychological damage he'd inflicted on innocent mourners. People like Mrs. Patterson, Helen, and my business colleagues needed to understand they'd been manipulated, not just deceived. "We need to confront Derek publicly," I decided. "At the asset transfer ceremony tomorrow morning. Let everyone who was at the funeral see that I'm alive and hear the truth about his conspiracy." Helen squeezed my hand supportively. "After what he put us all through, he deserves to be exposed in front of everyone he deceived." Cassandra nodded grimly. "And Romano's people need to see that Derek won't be able to pay his debt. If they think he was planning to steal from organized crime, the consequences will be severe." Detective Wright confirmed our plan would work with their investigation. "We'll coordinate the arrests with your public revelation. Derek and his conspirators will be taken into custody immediately after you expose the fraud." As we finalized our plans for the morning confrontation, I felt a mixture of anticipation and sadness. Justice would be served, but the damage to family relationships and personal trust could never be completely repaired. Derek had destroyed not just financial assets, but the faith and love of everyone who cared about our family. The next morning, Preston Willis had arranged the asset transfer ceremony at First National Bank's private conference room, where Derek would officially gain access to my accounts and begin liquidating my estate. The setting was perfect for our planned confrontation because it would include witnesses from multiple aspects of Derek's conspiracy. I arrived early, still disguised, and positioned myself where I could observe the ceremony's participants. Derek and Brittany sat at the main conference table with Preston, reviewing documents and preparing for the money transfers. Bank manager Thomas Chen had arranged the necessary paperwork, while Leonard the accountant provided financial statements supporting the transactions. Romano's representatives were also present, though they maintained a discreet distance from the official proceedings. Vincent Romano himself had come to ensure the debt collection, accompanied by 2 enforcers who made everyone in the room visibly nervous. Their presence added an element of immediate danger to our confrontation plan. At exactly 9:30, Detective Wright and Detective Rodriguez entered the conference room with several backup officers, though they initially remained inconspicuous near the entrance. Helen and Cassandra took seats in the back, prepared to provide supporting testimony about Derek's confession and the evidence we'd gathered. Preston began the ceremony with his usual false solemnity, reading aloud the legal documents that supposedly authorized Derek's access to my estate. By order of the probate court and in accordance with Margaret Sullivan's last will and testament, all assets of the deceased are hereby transferred to the primary beneficiary, Derek Sullivan. Derek played his grieving son role perfectly, speaking about his reluctance to handle such financial matters so soon after losing his mother. "I just want to honor her memory and use this inheritance responsibly," he said, his voice catching with fake emotion. Bank manager Chen began explaining the transfer procedures, but I decided the charade had continued long enough. Standing up from my chair in the back corner, I removed my hat and sunglasses, allowing everyone in the room to see my face clearly for the first time. "That won't be necessary," I announced in a voice that carried throughout the conference room. "Since I'm very much alive, there's no inheritance to transfer." The silence that followed was deafening. Derek's face went through a series of expressions, from confusion to recognition to absolute terror as he realized his entire scheme was collapsing. Brittany gasped audibly and grabbed Derek's arm, her own face draining of all color. Preston immediately began sputtering denials and accusations, but Detective Wright stepped forward with his badge visible. "Preston Willis, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of legal documents, and insurance fraud. You have the right to remain silent." The next few minutes were chaotic as multiple arrests occurred simultaneously. Derek tried to run but was stopped by Detective Rodriguez before he reached the exit. Brittany collapsed into her chair, sobbing and claiming she'd been manipulated into participating against her better judgment. "This is impossible," Derek kept repeating as the handcuffs were applied. "You're supposed to be dead. I saw the death certificate. I planned your funeral." "You planned the funeral of an innocent homeless woman whose body you desecrated," I replied coldly. "Her name was Sarah Martinez, and she deserved better than being burned beyond recognition to support your criminal scheme." Romano's representatives watched the arrests with calculating expressions, clearly realizing their money wouldn't be forthcoming. Romano himself approached Derek as the police prepared to escort him out. "You owe me $200,000, Romano said quietly but menacingly. "Dead mothers can't pay debts, but living mothers can. I suggest you find a way to honor your obligations from prison, because my patience has limits." Derek's terror increased as he realized the consequences of his failed scheme extended far beyond legal prosecution. Romano's organization didn't forgive debts just because the debtor was incarcerated, and Derek would face ongoing threats until the money was paid. Cassandra stepped forward to provide her evidence to the detectives, including the recordings of Derek's confessions and photographs of the forged documents. "He tried to recruit me 3 months ago," she testified. "When I refused to participate, he threatened to have me cut out of the inheritance completely." Helen also provided testimony about Derek's behavior during the funeral planning, describing his eagerness to provide accident details and his lack of genuine grief. "I knew something was wrong from the first day," she said. "No son who really lost his mother would be so focused on practical arrangements instead of being devastated by grief." Bank manager Chen was visibly shaken as he realized how close he'd come to facilitating major financial fraud. The documents appeared completely legitimate, he protested. We had death certificates, court orders, everything seemed properly authorized. That's because Derek corrupted multiple professionals to create false documentation, Detective Wright explained. Dr. Williams falsified the death certificate, Leonard Wright provided unauthorized financial information, and several family members provided false alibis and testimony. As Derek was led away in handcuffs, he made one final attempt to justify his actions. You don't understand the pressure I was under, he shouted desperately. Romano would have killed me if I didn't pay him back. I didn't have any choice. You had choices, I replied firmly. You could have asked me for help with your gambling problems. You could have gotten professional treatment for your addiction. Instead, you chose to stage my death and steal everything I worked my entire life to build. Brittany's arrest was equally dramatic, though she continued claiming victimhood until the end. Derek promised me we'd just borrow the money temporarily, she sobbed. He said we'd pay it all back once his business ventures started succeeding. I never wanted to hurt anybody. Detective Rodriguez wasn't buying Brittany's innocent act. You personally contacted real estate agents about selling Margaret's house, arranged estate sales for her personal belongings, and helped coordinate the story about her extended trip to Montana. That's not temporary borrowing, that's permanent theft. Preston's arrest was the most satisfying because his corruption had enabled the entire conspiracy. Without his willingness to forge legal documents and falsify court orders, Derek's scheme would have been impossible to execute. I was just providing legal services to a grieving family, Preston protested as he was handcuffed. Everything I did was within the bounds of professional legal practice. Forging wills, falsifying court orders, and filing fraudulent insurance claims is not legal practice, Detective Wright replied. You corrupted the entire legal system to help commit massive financial fraud. As the arrests concluded and the conference room cleared, I stood with Helen and Cassandra, trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. Derek's conspiracy had been exposed, justice was being served, but the emotional damage to our family relationships could never be completely repaired. What happens now with Romano? Cassandra asked quietly. That's Derek's problem to solve, I replied. I won't pay his gambling debts, but I also won't let him be murdered in prison. If he's willing to accept responsibility and seek treatment for his addiction, I might consider helping him find legal ways to address his obligations. Helen shook her head sadly. I can't believe he put you through this. Making all of us think you were dead, staging an elaborate funeral, corrupting your own family members. How does someone become so cruel? Gambling addiction combined with criminal influences, I answered. Derek needed money desperately, and Romano's organization provided him with contacts who could facilitate this kind of fraud. But that doesn't excuse the choices he made or the people he hurt. 6 months later, I sit in my home office writing this story and reflecting on how Derek's betrayal ultimately led to unexpected positive changes in my life. The legal resolution of his conspiracy was swift and comprehensive, but the personal healing process has taken much longer and required difficult decisions about forgiveness, family relationships, and moving forward. Derek was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for fraud, identity theft, and insurance crimes. Brittany received 3 years for her role as a willing conspirator, though her lawyer's strategy of claiming manipulation by Derek helped reduce her sentence. Preston Willis, as the professional who enabled the entire scheme, received 7 years and was permanently disbarred from practicing law. The other family members and professionals who participated in the conspiracy faced various consequences. Martha and Harold were sentenced to community service and probation for their relatively minor roles providing false alibis. Dr. Williams lost his medical license and faced substantial civil penalties for falsifying my death certificate. Leonard the accountant was banned from practicing and required to pay significant restitution for his role in the financial fraud. The most challenging aspect of recovery was rebuilding trust with the people Derek had deceived on my behalf. Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor, was deeply embarrassed about being manipulated and initially avoided speaking with me. Helen struggled with guilt about planning my memorial service and wondered how she could have been fooled so completely. Many of my business colleagues questioned their own judgment about Derek's character and sincerity. I spent considerable time reaching out to everyone who had attended the funeral, explaining the circumstances of Derek's deception and assuring them that their grief and support had been genuine responses to what they believed was a real tragedy. Most people were understanding and grateful to learn the truth, though some relationships were permanently damaged by the psychological manipulation they'd experienced. Helen and I have grown closer than ever, bonded by our shared experience of surviving Derek's elaborate deception. She often jokes that she's earned the right to be suspicious of any future family emergencies, but she's also become my strongest advocate for moving forward positively rather than dwelling on Derek's betrayal. Cassandra has become the daughter I never had. Her courage in gathering evidence against Derek and her integrity in refusing to participate in his conspiracy despite personal threats showed a moral strength that makes me proud. Robert would have been incredibly proud of how she handled the situation, and I've updated my will to reflect her importance in my life. My consulting business actually grew stronger after the publicity surrounding Derek's arrest. Many potential clients were impressed by how I'd handled the crisis and wanted to work with someone who'd demonstrated such resilience under pressure. The story of surviving my own fake death became a powerful metaphor for overcoming seemingly impossible business challenges. The financial recovery was straightforward since Derek never actually gained access to my assets. All the forged documents were invalidated, the fake insurance claims were reversed, and my estate remained intact. I used some of the money Derek had intended to steal to establish a foundation providing addiction treatment resources for people struggling with gambling problems. Derek's relationship with Romano was resolved through the legal system rather than street justice. The FBI's investigation into the inheritance fraud led to broader charges against Romano's organization, ultimately resulting in federal racketeering prosecutions that sent Romano and his associates to prison for much longer terms than Derek received. I visit Derek in prison once every few months, not to provide comfort, but to encourage him to take responsibility for his choices and work toward genuine rehabilitation. He's enrolled in addiction treatment programs and has expressed remorse for his actions, though I remain cautious about trusting his sincerity given his demonstrated ability to manipulate people's emotions. I know I can never undo the damage I caused, Derek told me during our most recent visit. But I want you to know that planning your fake death was the most shameful thing I've ever done. I betrayed everything you and Robert taught me about family and integrity. Whether his remorse is genuine or another manipulation remains to be seen, but I'm committed to giving him opportunities to prove he's capable of change. When he's released from prison, he'll face the challenge of rebuilding his life without the inheritance he tried to steal, but also without the gambling debts that drove him to such desperate measures. Brittany has shown no interest in reconciliation or taking responsibility for her role in the conspiracy. Her letters from prison consistently blame Derek for manipulating her and express anger about the consequences she's facing. I suspect she'll continue making poor choices after her release, but that's no longer my responsibility or concern. The most meaningful outcome of this entire experience has been discovering how many people genuinely care about me and were willing to help when I needed support. Detective Wright and Detective Rodriguez became friends who check on me regularly. Bank manager Chen implemented new procedures to prevent inheritance fraud at his institution. Even Romano, before his own arrest, expressed grudging respect for how I'd outmaneuvered Derek's scheme. I've also become an advocate for elder protection and inheritance fraud prevention. Speaking at conferences and workshops, I share Derek's story as a warning about how family members can be corrupted by financial desperation and criminal influences. Many audiences are shocked by the sophistication of modern inheritance scams and the importance of having multiple safeguards against family betrayal. The psychological healing continues daily. Some mornings I wake up angry about Derek's betrayal and the family relationships that were permanently damaged by his choices. Other days I feel grateful for having survived his scheme and discovered the strength to fight back against seemingly impossible odds. Robert's memory has been a constant source of comfort throughout this process. I know he would have been proud of how I handled Derek's betrayal and would have supported my decisions about forgiveness and moving forward. The foundation I established in his name provides addiction treatment resources that might prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. Looking toward the future, I'm more cautious about trust but also more appreciative of genuine relationships. Helen, Cassandra, and the friends who supported me during this crisis have earned my complete confidence. New relationships will be built more carefully, with better understanding of how desperation and criminal influences can corrupt even family bonds. My consulting business continues to grow, and I've added specialization in family crisis management and fraud prevention to my services. Helping other families navigate betrayal and financial manipulation has become a meaningful way to use my experience positively rather than simply surviving Derek's attack on my life. The money Derek tried to steal continues to fund charitable works, business growth, and family support, exactly as Robert and I always intended. Derek's scheme ultimately failed to accomplish any of his goals, while strengthening my resolve to use our wealth responsibly and protect against future manipulation. As I finish writing this story, I realize that surviving Derek's betrayal taught me important lessons about resilience, the value of genuine relationships, and the importance of fighting back against injustice. While I wouldn't choose to experience such trauma again, I'm grateful for the strength and wisdom gained through surviving my own fake death and emerging stronger than before. If you've been moved by this story of family betrayal and ultimate justice, I'd love to hear about your own experiences with family challenges in the comments below. Have you ever faced betrayal from someone you trusted completely? How did you find the strength to fight back and rebuild your life? Please hit the like button if this story resonated with you, and subscribe for more true stories about overcoming seemingly impossible odds. Share this video with anyone who might need encouragement about surviving family betrayal, and remember that even the darkest deceptions can be overcome with courage, allies, and determination to seek justice. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you always have the strength to fight for truth when faced with those who would erase you for their own gain.